Hey guys, tonight, we slip into a pale London fog so thick it feels like it could be ladled into a bowl, only you'd be spitting out coal dust and stale gin on the first spoonful. The air has weight here, a damp heaviness that clings to your skin and seeps through your coat. Gas lamps stand sentry along the street, their flames wavering inside glass chimneys, stained with soot, casting halos that can't quite push back the gloom. The cobblestones under your boots are slick with drizzle, each uneven surface shining faintly, as if polished for an audience of no one. From somewhere in the distance comes the hollow clop of a horse's hooves, muffled and strange in the fog, like footsteps in a dream. Shops crouch low along the lane, their painted signs swinging gently on iron brackets. The lettering is faded from years of soot and rain, but a careful eye can still pick out the promises, tailors, apothecaries, coffee houses, and the occasional curiosity shop, whose window hints at objects better left unexplained. A door slams somewhere down an alley, followed by the quick, high trill of a whistle. Two short bursts that might mean a client has been found, or that the constable has turned the corner. You won't know until it's too late. You probably won't survive this stroll without a little scandal clinging to your coat. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time the clock is striking for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Through the haze, a figure emerges, a slim woman in a frayed shawl, her shoulders hunched against the drizzle. She smiles, and you see more gaps than pearls in her grin. She jokes that her office hours outlast those of the mills. Considering some factories run 18-hour shifts, it's a grim sort of truth. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the night by the mid-19th century. London's official registers listed nearly 9,000 public women in a single year, a number quoted in parliamentary papers with sober authority. Yet historians still argue whether the real figure was twice as high or barely half. So much depended on who was doing the counting and what they wanted the numbers to prove. A gust of wind scuttles torn newspaper pages along the gutter, one of them plastering itself against your boot. You glance down to see a headline screaming "Virtue in Ruin" above an overwrought sketch of a fainting maiden, but your eye catches on the small ad wedged beneath it. Good time, 2 pennies, no questions. The fog muffles your laugh, but it lingers in your chest. The city sells everything, and not all of it can be stacked on a shelf. You pass a print shop, with its windows crowded by tawdry engravings, the kind hawked to customers who pretend to browse curiosities before slipping a coin for something more scandalous. Across the street, a constable leans on a lamppost, his fingers brushing his collar in a casual gesture, casual enough to hide the momentary exchange of a small coin from a passing man. The constable's smirk is quick, but not quick enough to miss. From a doorway, another woman peers out, her cheeks pale beneath a dusting of powder. She confides in a voice meant to be overheard that the secret to her fashionable pallor is a mix of rice starch and white lead. It's poison, of course, but she shrugs. Style often outlives safety in this part of the city. That's your quirky tidbit for the evening. A few steps farther on, you duck into a coffee house to shake the damp from your coat. The place smells of weak chicory and damp wool, the air thick with conversations that never climb above a murmur. Women in threadbare gloves cup porcelain mugs, as if the heat in the glaze might seep into their bones. A group of sailors tumbles in their voices, loud, their coats smelling of brine and tar. Coins hit the nearest table like bait dropped into water. Around the room, glances shift, chairs slide, and quiet deals begin a choreography, as intricate as any ballet rehearsed night after night, though performed here in worn-out shoes instead of satin slippers. When you step back into the drizzle, the air feels colder, sharper, Drops collect on your coat buttons until they're as cold as a creditor's heart. The smells of London crowd in roasted chestnuts from a street cart, the sour bite of sewage from a nearby drain, the damp scent of wet wool from passers-by. You skirt around a crooked iron fountain trickling into a shallow basin. 3 lemons, 2 wilted roses, and a pair of silk stockings float together in the water, like the props from a drunken still life painting. The fog swirls and thickens, wrapping around you like a damp blanket that forgot how to be warm. Somewhere ahead, the glow of a lantern beckons its light hazy and uncertain, pulling you deeper into a city that seems to rearrange itself with each step. Every doorway could be the entrance to a deal, a quarrel, or a promise. Every shadow might be hiding someone waiting for an opportunity or for you. And so you walk on your boots, clicking against the stones, following the rhythm of a place where survival is traded in gestures, glances, and coins warm from the palm. The night hums low and steady, like it's letting you in on a secret, but only if you're willing to keep it. You follow the curve of the street until the glow of the last lamp fades, leaving only a faint reflection of your own boots in the wet stones. The fog seems to part, reluctantly revealing a narrow alley that smells faintly of boiled cabbage and soot. At its end, a tradesman's door stands half open, its warped wood streaked with years of rain. Inside, the smell of soap greets you sharp but not unpleasant, and you step into the scullery of a house that belongs to someone with far more rooms than they know how to keep clean. Domestic service, they say, is honest work. But honesty cuts both ways. A mainstream fact for you in mid-19th century Britain, domestic service was the single largest employer of women. Roughly 1 in 3 working women found themselves scrubbing, polishing, cooking, or carrying in someone else's home. The pay, however, could vanish with the slip of a hand or the sour turn of a mistress's mood. Historians still argue whether such service offered a rung on the social ladder or was simply a slower route to poverty's doorstep. Here in the kitchen, a cook is hunched over a pot of coffee, muttering that the master insists on exactly 7 minutes of grinding the beans. 6 minutes insults the bean, she says. 8 minutes is practically treason. You file that away under nonsense rules in your mental diary. At the far wall, a dented kettle hisses where it sits on the stone, scolding anyone who dares stand idle too long. A narrow stair climbs toward the attic, no wider than 2 feet, and steep enough to make your knees ache just looking at it. You climb anyway, each step groaning like it's tired of carrying other people's burdens. At the top, in a cramped room where the ceiling slopes low, a young woman sits by candlelight, sewing a tear in her petticoat. She hasn't seen her village since last harvest. The letters from her family sit unwritten because postage costs more than she earns in a week. She jokes that the candle is her most demanding roommate, always burning through the rent money. Your quirky tidbit arrives when she tells you about the attic mutiny of last winter, when the straw in the mattress poked so viciously through its ticking that 3 girls pulled it out, entirely stuffed their beds with old curtain fabric, and declared themselves free from prickles. The victory lasted 2 nights until the matron found out and confiscated the lot. 2 floors down, a bell rings somewhere in the house, a shrill reminder that even the air here belongs to someone else. The mistress calls for tea service, and a maid hurries down the hallway with a tray of china so delicate it could be worth more than her year's wages. A cup wobbles, chips, and skitters across the floor like a startled beetle. The mistress gasps, the butler sighs. Within the hour, the girl is handed her pay in a limp envelope minus the cost of the cup. You step outside with her into a drizzle that drapes itself over the street like thin muslin. She walks quickly, her boots sending little ripples across puddles. Lodgings that rent by the night flash their offers in peeling paint, kind landlady often meaning a room in a damp cellar with straw hammocks, Warm fire meaning you get to share it with 3 others. She reads one sign promising lodging in exchange for light household help, which she warns you translates into scrubbing, sweeping, and hauling water until your arms ache, unpaid labor disguised as kindness. It's not far off from a modern startup job description, minus the office biscuits. Cold seeps into your sleeves as the afternoon slides toward evening. The girl joins a queue at the back door of a public kitchen run by a charitable society. The soup is thin barley, the bread a shade paler than gravel. Volunteers insist it nourishes the spirit. She eats quickly, aware that the line behind her is growing. Around the benches, you hear trades of an entirely different sort. Uniform buttons swapped for bread rolls. Hair sold to wig makers for a single shilling, a smile or song offered in hopes of securing a place to sleep. She tells you that wig makers pay extra for hair washed in lavender water, and some girls will scavenge perfume scraps from chemists' rubbish bins just to raise their price. By dusk, the street lamps flare back to life, each one hissing softly as it swallows a bubble of gas. Under a railway arch, a little hiring market springs up, women standing with skirts pinned to dodge puddles, waiting for someone to offer a day's cleaning work. Employers walk past, inspecting teeth posture and hands as if choosing a horse. She lands a job washing floors for 3p, but when it's done, the matron frowns and pays her only 1, claiming she worked too slowly. Hunger forces quick arithmetic. 1 coin is enough for a crust of bread and maybe a corner in a doss house. 2 would rent a rope bed strung wall to wall so lodgers can sleep leaning forward like laundry hung to dry. Rumor says Commercial Street offers quicker money men who don't ask for references or speed tests. You follow her there, watching as she leans against a lamppost and arranges her shawl to show just enough ankle. A constable wanders past, whistling a hymn in time with his wink. He warns her about the new inspectors prowling tonight, ready to haul any woman to the hospital on suspicion alone. She thanks him with a smile, the kind that costs nothing but might buy 5 minutes of safety. Rain begins in earnest, drumming on the cobbles like impatient fingers. In the shelter of a doorway, she meets her first client, a man smelling faintly of printer's ink, muttering about deadlines. He offers a silver 6p. She accepts. Later, she will calculate 1 coin feeds her tonight. 2 rent a bed, 3 might buy a tiny cushion against tomorrow's storms. The street glistens under the lamps as you walk away, boots tapping in time with the unspoken truth. You don't need to fall far to land here. Sometimes all it takes is 1 chipped teacup. The drizzle turns to a steadier rain by the time you reach the next corner. The cobblestones wearing a slick, mirrored sheen that doubles every lamp into a trembling reflection. Just ahead, the golden glow of a gin palace spills onto the street, inviting as a hearth in winter. The carved doors stand open, their brass handles polished bright by hundreds of hands. Stepping inside is like walking into a different climate, heat chatter, and the sharp, sweet tang of juniper wrapping around you. The place is a riot of ornamentation. Gilded cornices curl above your head, blue-tinted glass lamps bathe the bar in a strange aquatic glow, and mirrors line every wall, multiplying the crowd until it seems you've stepped into a carnival of selves. A mainstream fact sparkles here in the gaslight. After the 1830 Beerhouse Act relaxed licensing laws, gin palaces bloomed along London's main roads, their lavish facades competing with church spires for attention. They were designed to lure in not just the working class, but also clerks and shopkeepers eager to sip in surroundings that made them feel wealthier than they were. At the long mahogany bar, the bartender polishes a glass with theatrical twirls, announcing that his latest concoction, a lemon-laced gin fizz, improves posture, complexion, and marital harmony if taken in heroic doses. You nearly snort into your sleeve at the delivery. That's your first light joke for the evening. The clientele here is a careful blend. Dock workers with calloused hands, clerks in ink-stained cuffs, a smattering of women in dresses that look just fashionable enough to pass as respectable to the untrained eye. In one corner, a woman adjusts the ostrich feathers on her bonnet, making sure they bob just so as she catches the gaze of a railway foreman. Coins clink discreetly onto the marble-topped table between them, the transaction buried under polite conversation about the weather. A quirky tidbit you overhear from a man leaning on the bar: the reason the blue lamps hang above the gin shelves isn't to match the decor, it's to disguise the cloudiness of cheap gin. Under that colored glow, even the roughest spirit looks like liquid sapphire. For years, entire streets glimmered with that hue at closing time, as if the city had decided to drink itself into a dream. A constable in a top hat strolls in his polished boots, squeaking slightly on the tiled floor. He tips his helmet to the bartender, who returns the gesture by slipping a discreet glass of gin behind the cover of a pewter tea urn. Officially, constables visit to keep order. Unofficially, they're here to understand the evidence in liquid form. Historians still argue whether their presence kept the peace or simply legitimized the excess. You weave through the crowd toward the back, where the atmosphere shifts from boisterous to conspiratorial. Here the light is dimmer, the chairs more plush, the conversations pitched just low enough that you can only catch fragments, mentions of shipping routes, a whispered address, a chuckle at a private joke. One table holds a railway engineer and a young man offering silk stockings at wholesale prices, which, judging by the raised eyebrow of his listener, might mean anything but wholesale. From this corner, you see the full sweep of the gin palace, the mirrored walls making the crowd seem endless. The steady rhythm of glasses filled and emptied, the gentle sway of bodies leaning closer to make themselves heard. The pianist in the corner hammers out a jaunty ragtime tune, never faltering, even when a drunken patron attempts to sing along 2 keys off and 2 beats behind. Your second joke comes courtesy of a portly man at the bar, who claims the pianist's quick hands come from dodging debt collectors since boyhood, a skill he clearly values almost as much as the music. By the time you make your way back toward the door, the rain outside sounds like 1,000 small drums against the windows. You notice one of the women who'd been seated with a group of sailors earlier, now standing at the threshold, shawl pulled tight, scanning the street. She catches your eye for half a second, then glances away, already reading the next opportunity in the shifting crowd. As you step back into the night, the blue glow from the gin palace follows you onto the slick street, mingling with the pale gold of the gas lamps. The air tastes of juniper, now layered over the coal smoke and damp. Somewhere down the lane, laughter bursts suddenly, then cuts off just as quickly, leaving only the steady hiss of rain. And you keep walking, boots steady against the wet stones, carrying the memory of mirrored walls and blue light, where every reflection hides a bargain, and every bargain hides a story you'll never fully know. You leave the rain-thrashed street for a quieter crescent, where curtains hang just so in polished windows, and brass knockers wear the discreet shine of frequent, careful use. A cabman who swears he only moves parcels, never people, murmurs a sequence of knocks, 3 slow, 2 quick. You try it. The door unlatches with a cat-like click, and you're welcomed not by smoke and clamor, but by beeswax sandalwood, and a hush so plush it makes your breath sound overdressed. A maid in spotless calico tags your coat and hat with ribboned cards, numbers, but no names, as if anonymity has joined the household staff. You tread Turkish runners that swallow footsteps, whole passing wall sconces veiled in pink silk, so the gaslight turns everyone faintly roseate, like they've been painted with a complimentary blush. A hostess glides forward in a gown the color of moonlight pearls, lying calm at her throat, voice low enough to file the corners off your thoughts. She gestures to a sideboard pale green lemonade and a cordial for nerves, not sins. Your first joke arrives when she confides with a conspiratorial sparkle that the secret ingredient is cucumber water and audacity, both best served chilled. Through a lacquered arch, a parlor unfurls, chinoiserie panels, bamboo chairs polished to mirror shine a pagoda clock that chimes the quarter hour politely, as if reluctant to interrupt. Guests sit in twos and threes with illustrated journals open at articles no one is reading. Conversation is air-cushioned, full of theater reviews and opera rumors that hover like tame butterflies. It dawns slowly, this is a brothel that wears gentility like a bespoke glove. Your mainstream historical fact drifts in with the perfume under 19th century disorderly houses. Law premises like these risked closure if neighbors complained, but quiet manners, thick carpets, and the right acquaintances softened official frowns more effectively than locks ever could. A liveried footman offers a tray of tiny cards edged in lilac, each bearing a pseudonym, floral, as a seed catalog: Miss Astor, Miss Marigold, Miss Cherie. You select one and lay it on a silver salver. There's no thunderclap, just a door at the far end parting on oiled hinges, and Miss Astor appears in seafoam silk, her curtsy refined enough to pass inspection at court. She leads you down a gallery strung with paper lanterns painted with theater masks. Corridors that turn, ascend, descend, gentle misdirections that loosen your sense of compass and helpfully memory. A discreet peephole disguised as a cherry blossom bud gleams for a moment. She taps it, smiling insurance against surprise inspectors or surprise spouses. Here's your quirky tidbit: some houses mounted revolving bookcases that pivoted at a touch, swinging a boudoir into a reading room faster than you can say improving literature. You almost hope to see the trick performed the way one hopes to glimpse stage machinery, but the evening prefers suggestion to spectacle. Historians still argue whether establishments like this survived chiefly by neighborhood indifference, quiet bribes labeled subscriptions, or by patronage from officials who enjoyed the lemonade as much as the silence. The ledger ink was often as delicate as the upholstery. Miss Astor pauses before a lacquered door carved with cranes under a moon. Inside waits a pocket sitting room, damask wallpaper silvered with anemones, a low sofa heaped with tasseled cushions, a mantel clock guarded by porcelain spaniels with gold collars. She pours steaming chocolate from a Wedgwood pot. The aroma is velvet with a hint of rebellion. Your second joke twinkles when she notes that chocolate once required a license nearly as solemn as a bishop's blessing. So a cup here counts as both refreshment and minor civil disobedience. You sip, and the room's edges relax. On the mantel, a framed notice requests conversational tones, at all times redundant in carpets deep enough to muffle thunder. Music threads through from somewhere, an upright harmonium practicing scales soft as moth wings. Miss Astor admits she plays chamber pieces on Sundays, because the higher-paying nerves adore culture, and gestures to a stack of sheet music annotated in several hands and languages. On a side table rests a silver tray of rings and cameos. Patrons purchase trinkets as tokens instead of paying directly for time, a circular commerce that pleases accountants and consciences. You can picture tomorrow's visit to a discreet jeweler who melts sentiment back into liquidity. House economics drift in like a polite cough, imported silk flowers, perfumes that travel farther than rumors, gas mantles that constantly need replacing. The monthly bill for light, she sighs, could endow a small orphanage. Your third joke lands with a feather. She suspects orphans would dislike a gaslight diet anyway, so perhaps illumination does the most good right here. Behind the levity, the arithmetic is sober. Elegance is expensive camouflage. She shows you a narrow balcony curtained with ivy. Lanterns float in a courtyard fountain like small moons, water plopping a lullaby under the city's distant growl. Two silhouettes stroll below their voices, threaded to whispers. Miss Astor sets a crystal on the railing to charge in the moonlight a Welsh aunt's superstition. She swears misfortune bounces off anything that sparkles. Maybe it's nonsense. Maybe it's an old country technology as practical as a lucky pin in a hem. Either way, the crystal scatters crumbs of rainbow across the ivy leaves, and the evening inhales a little deeper. Back along the gallery, she points out a brass gong, whose single chime means deliveries, linen bundles, pastry boxes, sometimes a cage of canaries bound for the music room. Live birds outsing any gramophone, and the chorus conveniently smothers stray giggles behind keyholes. A privacy feature with feathers, she murmurs. In another alcove, a writing desk waits with embossed stationery and a silver tray of folded calling cards made up as fairy tale nobles, Mr. Ashcroft, Miss Lavinia Lady E. Staff Ferry, notes across the city by hand, threading the postal maze with a confidence bordering on sorcery. Your second mainstream fact nests in the library downstairs, where a ledger names veiled figures, not lists, donations to local improvement societies and benevolent funds, whose friendliness, like the carpets, is thick pile. In return, neighbors enjoy quiet halls and darkened windows at decent hours, and inspectors discover their evenings already spoken for. Historians still argue whether such philanthropy soothed civic consciences or simply purchased a shade darker than ordinary discretion. In the music room, a pianist wanders through Chopin like candlelight translated into sound. A woman with a violet ribbon pours two gentlemen claret with Duchess poise. She excuses herself on a phrase break and glides toward a spiral stair embroidered with golden curls. Conversation elsewhere never rises above theater hush. You realize the house is a machine for lowering voices, silk velvet screens, and rituals running in quiet tandem until even your thoughts whisper. Before you leave, the hostess returns you to the vestibule. The maid slips a sprig of lavender into your lapel, a scented calling card that says more than ink could. By the door, the doorman thinks of everything. He tucks a small envelope into your pocket with the careful neutrality of a person placing clouds. Later, you'll find a pressed violet, inside perfumed with bergamot, and a line written in a precise, untraceable hand. The violet lasts longer than the champagne. A smile tries not to form. It fails. Out on the crescent curtains, close with practiced politeness, the facade resuming its role as respectable scenery. Behind you, the door seals the hush like a specimen under glass. Ahead, the city's breath returns coal, smoke, damp stone, the tea and tin rattle of a night cart. You step back into the drizzle with a memory that won't gossip, an aftertaste of chocolate and jasmine that lingers just long enough to feel like a rumor you're unwilling to share. The pavement gleams. A carriage lamp blinks once from a corner, and the driver offers Piccadilly swiftly if the traffic behaves. You shake your head and walk instead, letting the soft city noise sand the edges off the evening. Your coat still holds a hint of lavender. Somewhere behind the ivy canaries turn down their own gaslights, and someone in seafoam silk practices a chord progression meant to soothe the last squeak out of a nervous heart. You pass one last window where a mirror catches the street and sends it back to itself 2 Londons for the price of stride. And if the reflection looks a degree kinder than the real thing, blame the silk shades. Houses like this are built to polish an image until even worry thinks it looks well. You breathe slow and even and tuck the pressed violet deeper into your pocket. Whatever else happens tonight, some part of you will carry a little silence carefully folded, scented with bergamot, ready for when the streets begin to speak too loudly again. The rain has eased to a damp mist, fine enough to bead on your eyelashes, but not enough to bother wiping away. You drift toward the main thoroughfare, where the warm hum of a crowd begins to push back the evening's chill. Here the street is less about straight lines and more about subtle codes, an unspoken grammar written in shawl folds, parasol tilts, and the timing of footsteps. The lamps are brighter along this stretch, each one casting a small stage of golden light on the wet cobbles. In those circles, women stand at what might look like idle ease to a passerby. But linger long enough, and you notice the details: a parasol angled slightly across the body signal for interest, tilted backward over the shoulder signal for warning, a ribbon tied in a bonnet with 3 loops meaning a client secured no need to hover. 1 loop danger, keep close. That's your quirky tidbit. For this section, these cues, subtle enough to be invisible to the untrained eye, were passed down almost like heirlooms. Some trace them back to 18th century ballad sellers, who used the same gestures to indicate fresh wares. Now they speak of living arrangements rather than printed verses. You stop under a lamp, where a woman in a crimson shawl laughs quietly to herself. She calls the shawl the original neon sign, boasting it draws patrons faster than any gaslight. Then she adds your first light joke, that it doubles as a blanket and a rain canopy when business is slow. On the opposite side of the street, a man in a shabby bowler taps the crown twice before adjusting it. From the shadows, another man appears, falling into step without a word. Across the way, a cab rattles past the driver, lifting his whip not in irritation, but in greeting a prearranged nod, promising transport to discreet lodgings in exchange for a pint at the end. Many drivers double as intermediaries, their routes a rolling map of private parlors and rooms rented by the hour. Your mainstream fact arrives with the rumble of carriage wheels by the late 19th century laws, like the 1885 Criminal Law Amendment Act, tightened scrutiny pushing transactions deeper underground. Historians still argue whether this made the work more dangerous or simply forced it into new patterns. Some say it reduced street visibility, others that it only multiplied hidden hazards. In a doorway ahead, a fiddler plays a sprightly reel, his bow bouncing so fast it looks ready to spark. Every 4th measure, a woman standing beside him twirls a strand of hair, twice a signal to another watcher at the corner that the coast remains clear. The fiddler leans toward you mid-tune and admits your second joke that his music is mostly noise, but the rhythm makes drunks think their legs are dancing better than their wallets are opening. You follow a woman down a narrower side street, her skirt hem lifted just enough to reveal stockings dyed a deep violet. She explains that exotic colors command attention, where plain black rules the night. The dye is no Parisian import. She says it's ribbons soaked in violet ink mixed with starch, a craft known among the women as making moonlight for legs. The farther you walk, the quieter the signals become. Now just the shuffle of footsteps, the quick tap of a cane, or the subtle shifting of a shawl edge. You watch as a constable passes, tapping his truncheon on a lamppost in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It isn't official. It's a friendly warning for those inclined to scatter before his partner rounds the corner. One woman nearby mutters your third joke that some constables ought to charge dance lesson rates for all the choreography they inspire. You pause by a shuttered chandler's shop, its sign painted with a stubby candle barely visible beneath the soot. A door to the side is cracked open, marked with tiny carved triangles no bigger than a fingernail. To most, they're scratches in the wood. To a knowing eye, they mark meeting points. Inside, you glimpse a single candle burning behind a screen, 2 figures conferring a third counting coins into a tobacco tin. No names, no introductions. When the candle gutters out, the negotiation is over. Back on the main road, the gas lamps hiss louder, as if impatient for the hour to pass. The crowd thins, but the stage remains set, lamplight wet stone-coated gestures. Every tilt-tap and glance carries meaning, binding together an invisible network of safety, opportunity, and warning. You tuck your hands into your coat pockets and walk on, wondering how many of these silent sentences you've already missed. How many trades whispered around you while your attention was busy with chestnut smoke or the fiddler's grin. The city exhales in a slow, knowing breath, and the street ahead feels taut with anticipation, as if the next lamp might illuminate not just a corner, but a whole new chapter in its private language. The mist drapes itself heavier now, like damp wool across your shoulders, as you turn into a lane where the glow of the lamps pools low to the ground. At the far end, a watchman leans against an iron post, his oilskin cloak shedding tiny rivulets into the gutter. He hums a tune you don't recognize, though the rhythm suggests he's done this circuit enough to keep time without looking at a clock. You notice how his eyes aren't scanning for trouble so much as for people he knows. And when a woman in a patched velvet cape approaches, he straightens not in alarm, but in greeting. She presses something small and silver into his palm. He nods once, then waves her on. Your mainstream historical fact comes with the glint of that coin. In poorer districts, Victorian constables often supplemented their official salaries with unofficial payments tolls for leaving people in peace. Historians still argue whether this arrangement made the streets safer by creating predictable order or simply entrenched corruption that kept danger in play. He moves off with the unhurried pace of someone whose presence is less about catching wrongdoing and more about keeping the peace in his own way. Boots clicking softly on wet stone, he stops now and then to chat with the women leaning in the shadowed thresholds. Names are exchanged in a low murmur. He warns two of them that a certain sergeant, zealous as his mustache is wide, is prowling 2 streets over, so it's best they stay in this lane where he can keep things calm. That earns him a chuckle from one woman who calls him our midnight butler and tips her bonnet in mock gratitude. Your first light joke lands when he bows back and replies that he'd happily polish the pavement next, if they provide the soap. The smells here are distinct, a mingling of damp rope from a grocer's delivery and the sweet bruising scent of overripe apples in a bin. You step aside as a carriage rattles past its driver, flicking a coin toward the watchman without slowing. The coin skids, but a barefoot boy darts out to snatch it before it stops spinning, saluting both men before vanishing like steam into the alleys. That's your quirky tidbit. Some drivers tied small coins to their whips to flick at constables, a gesture both bribe and greeting meant to keep inspections light and journeys quick. Farther along the lane narrows. The watchman pauses at a makeshift shelter under a tattered awning. 3 figures sit on overturned crates, counting their night's takings in the flicker of a stubby tallow candle. He clears his throat, and without breaking conversation, they each slide something into his glove. 1 coin, 1 folded scrap of paper, 1 ring missing its stone. Trinkets travel as easily as silver when discretion is the currency. He pockets them all, tips his helmet, and moves on. You shadow him into a brighter thoroughfare, where the glow from shop fronts lends a temporary shine to his brass buttons. Here his posture changes, shoulders back steps, sharper, the image of a proper officer. Your second joke comes from a roasted nut vendor calling out evening inspector, a title that outranks him by 3 levels, but apparently sells more chestnuts. The watchman tosses him a halfpenny anyway, maybe for the salesmanship, maybe for the joke. Crossing to the other side, you catch a flicker of motion near a shuttered tobacconist. 2 women slip into a side passage lantern dimmed to a faint heartbeat of light. The watchman's eyes follow them, but he doesn't move to stop them. He only adjusts his whistle cord and resumes his slow patrol. The drizzle returns, beating along the curve of your hat brim and dripping steadily onto the street. Under its patter, you can hear the low murmur of transactions happening just beyond sight. Boots scuffing on stone coins, chiming softly into hands, the occasional laugh short, contained, never careless. You keep pace with the watchman a little longer, noting how his whistle changes tone when a stranger approaches a rising trill to warn a flat note to dismiss. The women respond in kind, adjusting shawls or shifting positions without a word spoken. It's its own economy of signals layered atop the earlier parasol tilts and ribbon knots, as intricate as any merchant's trade network. At the next corner, he stops under a lamp and lights a pipe, the match flare briefly gilding his face. The smoke rises in a pale coil, twisting into the mist above. He exhales slowly, then glances at you with the faintest suggestion of a smile, as if to say, this is how the night keeps itself balanced. Then he turns away, swallowed back into the rhythm of his circuit boots, whistle low murmur the occasional clink of coin. You watch him disappear into the damp glow, leaving behind a street that feels at once guarded and utterly exposed, depending on which side of his favor you happen to stand. And then you walk on boots, tapping in counterpoint to the soft hiss of rain, wondering just how many bargains tonight's silver has bought and for whom. The rain shifts from mist to fine drizzle as you round a corner and come face to face with a public notice plastered to a lamppost. Its bold lettering trembles in the damp breeze. Contagious Diseases Act. Public warning. Below in smaller print, it spells out the power given to police and medical officers to detain and examine any woman suspected of improper habits. The words feel less like information and more like a netcast wide enough to catch anyone the authorities choose. A woman in a straw bonnet is reading it too, her gloved hands clenched around a worn shawl. She mutters to you that the inspectors are camped 2 streets over near the chemist's, waiting for women headed toward the taverns. Once they take you, she says you might not leave for weeks, months if they fancy it. And when you do, everyone will know where you've been. Here's your mainstream historical fact, beginning in 1864. The Contagious Diseases Acts gave police in designated towns, and later in London, the right to compel women to undergo invasive medical exams, often without solid evidence of infection. Historians still argue whether these laws reduced disease rates among soldiers and sailors, or simply punished the poor while leaving wealthier clients untouched. A constable in a gray greatcoat lingers under the lamplight, jotting names into a notebook. When a woman steps into the glow, he mutters something, signals to a partner, and she vanishes into a waiting carriage with curtained windows. The horses stamp and snort, their breath clouding in the cold. It's a scene you could mistake for an abduction, if not for the official seal painted on the carriage door. Past the chemist's shop, a man with a voice as syrupy as his cough drops Hawk's hygienic powders and purifying drafts that he claims will make any lady unmolested by official interference. Your first joke slips in when he adds that his tonic also repels unpleasant in-laws, though no one seems sure if that's a cure or a side effect. Women pass him coins for the little vials, hiding them deep in their reticules like talismans. In the shadow of a railway arch, you hear 2 women swapping advice: avoid Limehouse Basin tonight. Keep to the streets where the lamps flicker. If stopped, insist you're headed to a sick aunt. One offers a trick that sounds absurd, but carries the weight of desperate invention: rub a drop of onion juice in each eye. So tears seem natural, convincing inspectors you're only grieving. That's your quirky tidbit proof that a vegetable can become armor in the right hands. From a nearby public house comes the clatter of mugs and a burst of fiddle music. Inside, a serving girl leans over and whispers that one inspector thinks himself a poet and will let a woman go free if she can recite a sonnet without faltering. Your second joke lands when she adds that most patrons fake coughing fits to avoid hearing his rhymes, which she says are worse than the examinations themselves. Farther on, the familiar glow of a hospital lantern cuts through the fog. At the gates, two nurses in stiff white caps usher in new arrivals. Through the bars, you see women seated on benches, faces pale under kerosene light. Some clutch rosaries, others stare fixedly at the floor. Inside, the routine is mechanical examination, mandatory treatment, documentation, release only when deemed clean. On a side wall, a bill advertises voluntary checkups, promising a certificate to carry as proof of health. Historians still argue whether these slips of paper protected women from harassment or branded them forever as suspect, making their freedom conditional. A hackney driver idles nearby, tapping his reins. For a fee, he says he'll take women to districts where inspectors rarely patrol, though the cost is more than a week's honest earnings. The church clock above the hospital chimes 11. In the sudden quiet that follows, you hear the measured march of another patrol approaching. Women scatter into doorways, shawls pulled high. One darts behind a horse trough, splashing her hem in cold water. Your third joke comes courtesy of a stable boy who mutters that the inspectors themselves could use a dose of onion tears. Maybe then they'd weep enough to fog their own spectacles. The fog thickens, curling between the iron railings, dimming every glow except the hospital lantern. You walk on, feeling the air grow heavier with coal smoke, and the faint tang of disinfectant, the sound of boots and carriage wheels trailing you into the next street. In this part of the city, the law doesn't just watch, it waits. And every shadow you pass might be someone's last moment of freedom before the door of the curtained carriage closes. The next turn takes you into a narrower street, where the drizzle seems to hang mid-air, reluctant to fall. At the far end, a chapel's wooden doors stand ajar, spilling warm candlelight onto the slick stone steps. The notes of a hymn drift out thin but steady. You'd think it was an ordinary evening service until you notice that most of the women clustered outside are not here for worship, but for the space just inside the doorway, where the rain can't quite reach. A tall woman in a bonnet trimmed with white lace descends the steps, a wicker basket looped over one arm. She moves with the measured certainty of someone who has rehearsed every word she will say tonight. One by one, she presses folded pamphlets into waiting hands. The title on yours, framed by ornate flourishes, reads, "Hope for the Fallen." Inside are pages of scripture, moral appeals, and an address for a home of reform. She leans closer, dropping her voice as if sharing a secret. The home offers warm beds, daily lessons in proper conduct and safety from the streets. Your first joke arrives when she adds that no dancing is permitted except when giving thanks, as if gratitude itself were the only waltz allowed. Across the street, a bearded man in a broad-brimmed hat waves a placard declaring, "Vice destroys nations." He plants his boots in a puddle, seemingly immune to the cold seeping through the leather. A pair of young girls, more curious than converted, mimic his gestures behind gloved hands, stifling laughter. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the evening by the mid-19th century. Organizations such as the London Female Mission and the Salvation Army regularly patrolled entertainment districts, distributing religious literature and offering lodging to women they considered vulnerable. Historians still argue whether these efforts truly saved lives or simply corralled the desperate into different forms of control. The rain patters against the chapel roof, mingling with the sharp clang of a small triangle bell. Its chime signals the start of what the reformers call a walk of rescue. Women in bonnets gather into a loose formation, scanning the faces of those loitering nearby. For some, the call offers a reprieve. For others, it's a summons to confinement dressed in piety. Near the curb, a soup cart stands ready, steam curling from its battered lid. A hand-painted sign announces blessed sustenance. The broth smells mostly of turnip and dill. The reformer ladling it out thanks each recipient loudly by name, a public affirmation that also draws curious stares from the street. Your second joke slips in when a man mutters that the soup is holy because it performs miracles, turning turnip water into divine patience, so long as you close your eyes while swallowing. A few steps away, a covered wagon waits, its canvas sides painted with white lilies. Inside, benches line the walls around a small kerosene heater. A cluster of hesitant women shuffle forward, guided by reformers with gentle hands and practiced smiles. One whispers to another that the wagon leads to a reform home where sewing, prayer, and silence fill the days. She hesitates on the step, weighing hunger against the thought of surrendering her autonomy. From the shadows of a nearby carriage arch, another woman watches the line, her back pressed to the cold brick. She slips away unseen, choosing the familiar risks of the street over the unknown rules behind painted lilies. That moment, the turnaway is almost invisible, but it hums with quiet defiance. Your quirky tidbit for this section: some reform societies paid bounties to those who brought in fallen women. The practice tempted informers to exaggerate claims of vice just to earn a few coins, sparking disputes that sometimes required constables to mediate between zealous reformers and furious families. The wagon's wheels creak into motion, its passengers stiff-backed under the heater's orange glow. One reformer beside you hums a hymn, her voice weaving through the street noise until a rowdy cheer erupts from a tavern down the way, breaking the spell. The reformers pull their shawls tighter and turn toward new faces, pamphlets poised like small swords of righteousness. Your third joke lands when a cart driver watching them mutters that pamphlets breed faster than London pigeons, and at least pigeons don't ask where you'll be sleeping tonight. By the time you step away from the chapel, the wagon has vanished into the fog, its lilies fading into the night. The hymn has quieted, replaced by the everyday hum of the city hooves, on wet stone, distant laughter, the soft hiss of gas lamps. The pamphlet is still in your hand, its print smudged by drizzle. You glance at the address for the reform home, but the street itself seems to be asking the question, is safety worth the trade for freedom? You follow the address on the damp pamphlet, out of curiosity, winding through lanes where the fog feels almost solid enough to lean against. A carved wooden sign finally comes into view over a heavy black gate, Hope House, for the reform of wayward women. The letters are dulled by soot, the ivy along the wall crisped silver with frost. When you pull the bell rope, the clang that answers is deep and slow, like it's been waiting all day for someone to disturb the quiet. The gate swings open just enough for a matron in a crisp navy dress to appear. Her starched cap looks rigid enough to stand without her. She ushers you in with a nod that's polite, but leaves no doubt she's measuring you from boots to collar. Inside, the vestibule smells of soap candle grease, and just a trace of lavender, as though someone tried to dress the air in its Sunday best. Benches line the hall where a dozen women sit, hands folded neatly, eyes lowered, except for the occasional quick glance toward a chalkboard listing the day's schedule. Dawn prayers, sewing lessons midday, broth moral instruction, evening hymn lights out at 9. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Victorian rescue homes like this, often funded by churches or philanthropists, multiplied after the 1840s, promising moral reform for women deemed fallen. The reality was more regimented, strict schedules, hard work, and rules that often mirrored those of prisons. Historians still argue whether these institutions offered protection or simply replaced one form of control with another. The matron leads you into the dining hall. A cauldron of porridge bubbles on a blackened iron range, sending up a smell more starchy than appetizing. A serving girl, barely out of girlhood herself, ladles portions into tin bowls. Your first joke lands when a woman at the end of the table whispers that the porridge can double as wallpaper paste, so at least it's versatile. From there, the group files into a sewing room. Tall windows, fogged with condensation, let in a dim, cold light. Women sit in rows at pine tables, fingers darting through fabric mending donated garments for resale piecing quilts, bound for charity bazaars. Your quirky tidbit arrives when one woman leans in to say many quilts bear hidden initials stitched into corner seams, tiny acts of authorship from women whose names will vanish from records. It's part rebellion, part legacy. Later, in a parlor furnished with heavy oak chairs, a clergyman in spectacles reads from a leather-bound book. His voice rises and falls in a cadence meant to soothe, though the stillness it produces feels more like a pause between orders. He speaks of redemption duty and humility. Some women nod. Others stare at their calloused hands as if counting the stitches sewn since dawn. The dormitory upstairs is lined with narrow iron beds, each topped with a coarse woolen blanket. A locked cupboard at the far end holds confiscated letters and keepsakes removed to protect the soul from worldly temptation. One older woman murmurs that she hasn't seen her daughter's handwriting in 3 years. Your second joke flickers darkly from another bed. Someone dreams of trading all the house's hourglasses for a single clock that forgets to chime. In a side room, a nurse in a faded uniform tends a shelf of bottles, mostly water-scented with herbs, though she calls them tonics. She smiles faintly and admits that half the cures here could be replaced with a warm bath and 2 biscuits if the budget stretched that far. Outside in the courtyard, laundry whips in the wind like surrender flags. A nun feeds crumbs to sparrows, explaining that in summer they earn their keep by keeping the flies down. She confides your quirky tidbit that some women sew a sparrow feather into their apron hem for luck, believing it softens the matron's gaze. As evening settles, the women gather in a small chapel lit by tall candles. Their hymn rises thin but steady, filling the rafters darkened by soot. The matron stands at the backhands, clasped her expression somewhere between pride and vigilance. When the service ends, the candles are snuffed one by one until only the embers glow from the stove remains. Stepping outside, you feel the cold snap at your collar. Behind you, the heavy gate closes with a groan. Beyond its walls, the city hum resumes cartwheels, rattling distant laughter from a tavern. Inside, time will be marked grain by grain in hourglasses, the steady churn of work and prayer folded into every day. And for those within, freedom is measured not by distance, but by the faint space between rules. The streets beyond Hope House are quieter now, the night deepening into the hour when the city's energy thins but never quite fades. You pass shuttered shops and the occasional glow of a coffee house still doing business, its windows fogged with steam and tobacco smoke. The murmurs inside are thick and low, the kind you hear when people are speaking of things they don't intend to write down. On one corner, a newsstand owner is folding up the last of his broadsheets. You glance at a headline sprawled in blocky type, Vice Crisis Shocking New Figures. The article claims to reveal the true number of London's public women for the year. The figure is as precise as it is suspicious, 5432. Your mainstream historical fact arrives here. Official police registers in the mid-19th century often recorded around 9,000 women in London as common prostitutes in a given year, but reformers and moralists sometimes published estimates many times higher. Historians still argue whether these inflated numbers reflected hidden realities or were simply tools to stir outrage and funding. A clerk with round spectacles stands nearby, scribbling the latest totals on a blackboard outside a coffee house. He admits your first light joke that he once wrote 100,000 just to see if the bishop fainted on his morning walk. He grins, but his eyes flick down the street as if to make sure no constables overhear. Inside the coffee house, the air is a thick stew of boiled chicory pipe smoke and fresh printer's ink. 2 men at a corner table are in the middle of a heated debate, one waving a penny paper that insists there's one public woman For every 30 men in the city, the other thumping a church report that claims it's closer to 1 for every 200. They talk over each other, each certain his source is unimpeachable. Your quirky tidbit drifts from the counter. The owner says he sells more scandal sheets than coffee most nights, and the higher the numbers printed, the faster the papers sell. Truth doesn't sell a second cup, he says, but a good gasp will. Toward the back, a printer oils the gears of his hand press. He tells you in a half-whisper that he runs 2 versions of the same broadside, one with respectable statistics for polite readers, another with wilder numbers for those who like their outrage with extra spice. Your second joke comes when he says his press has 2 settings, truth and profitable, and only one keeps the ink flowing after midnight. Back on the street, you follow a small crowd into a drafty hall that smells faintly of beeswax and damp wool. A hand-painted placard promises an honest count of vice in our streets tonight only. Inside, a man with the air of a self-proclaimed expert strides onto the stage, clutching a thick notebook. He rattles off figures so quickly they blur together, comparing them to the number of cabarets, loaves of bread, and church tithes in a year. Murmurs ripple through the audience. Some gasp, others chuckle. A pair of seamstresses behind you whisper that if these numbers were true, their whole workshop would be empty before payday. They confess your quirky tidbit that they sometimes bet buttons on how high each speaker's estimate will climb. Buttons, not coins, so they can play without risking wages. The lecture crescendos with a stern warning that London teeters on a moral precipice and that a new committee must audit every ward by the month's end. Just as his voice reaches its most dramatic pitch, a draft from the hall door blows out 2 of the stage candles. Your third joke slips in when someone mutters that even the candles can't stomach another tally, drawing muffled laughter that shuffles quickly back into the room's polite hush. When the lecture ends, the audience disperses into the fog, their conversations folding into the city's nighttime hum. The blackboard outside the coffee house still bears the inflated totals, now smudged by someone's careless shoulder. The newsstand shutters close. You walk on, realizing that in this city, numbers have their own kind of commerce, traded, inflated, and bartered for influence. The truth is less important than the story a number can tell, and the stories sell best when they keep people awake at night. Here, even statistics have their price. The night air carries you toward a district where the fog thins enough for moonlight to touch the rooftops. Here, the clamor of carriages fades into the more delicate music of footsteps, low conversation, and the occasional bark of a dog keeping half-hearted watch. Ahead, the warm glow of an upstairs window spills across the street, outlining the curved iron rail of a balcony. Beneath it, a modest doorway stands open, the scent of wood polish and tallow candles drifting out. You step inside and find yourself in a boarding house not for the wealthy, but for women who work together, pooling their resources to keep a roof overhead without the oversight of a brothel keeper or the charity of a reform home. A woman with hair the color of walnut shell ushers you toward the common room, where 4 others sit around a scarred oak table mending garments and sharing a pot of tea. The air feels different here, still heavy with fatigue but threaded with the rare comfort of privacy. Your mainstream historical fact emerges in the steam rising from the teacups. While many women in the trade worked in brothels or on the street, others formed cooperative living arrangements, renting rooms together to share costs and avoid the strict rules and high cuts of an employer. Historians still argue whether these arrangements offered true independence or simply a softer version of the same risks. One of the women sewing a ribbon to the brim of a hat jokes your first light joke that they should hang a sign outside reading Vice, but respectably priced to keep expectations realistic. Another adds that they've already turned away. Two landladies who tried to raise rent once they learned the nature of their work. From the small kitchen comes the hiss of onions frying in a pan. The cook, a sturdy woman with an apron tied high, insists that fried onions make any home smell rich, even if there's nothing else to eat. That's your quirky tidbit, fried onions as olfactory camouflage, masking the scent of damp clothes or the absence of meat. The conversation turns to the rules of the house: no bringing clients upstairs after midnight, too much noise, no borrowing against the rent, and no fighting in the common room unless everyone gets a fair view. The last rule earns a laugh, but you sense it's been tested before. On a low shelf by the fire sits a ledger, its pages crowded with careful handwriting. Each woman contributes a set amount each week for rent, coal, and shared food. Above the ledger hangs a small, crooked picture of Queen Victoria, her face faintly yellowed with age. One of the women confesses she keeps it there for luck, though another mutters your second joke that the Queen's expression looks more like she's judging their housekeeping than blessing it. Upstairs, the narrow hallway is lined with mismatched rugs to muffle footsteps. Behind one door, a small desk is piled with letters and scraps of ribbon tokens from clients who wanted to leave something behind, but not something traceable. A woman in the corner works on a beaded purse, selling them at the Sunday market to supplement her income. In another room, a girl barely 20 hums as she washes her hair in a tin basin. She uses rainwater collected in a barrel on the roof, swearing it makes her hair softer than anything from a pump. She smiles and says her grandmother taught her that rainwater holds more sky than ground, which makes it lucky. You file that away as a quiet superstition worth remembering. Before you leave, they press a cup of tea into your hand. The china is chipped, the brew oversteeped, but the gesture is generous in a way that belongs entirely to the moment. Downstairs, the walnut-haired woman walks you to the door, pausing to check the street before letting you step out. The night air feels sharper now, the boarding house door closing behind you with a firm click. Its light remains on a small square of gold in the dark street, a sign that in a city of rules, deals, and tallies, there are still corners where people make their own terms. The street tilts downhill toward the river, where the fog grows thicker and the air tastes faintly of salt. You follow the curve of the quay until you reach a stretch of warehouses, their brick faces streaked with years of coal smoke and rain. By day, these buildings swallow goods from across the empire: tea, timber, tobacco. By night, they play host to a quieter, less official trade. A lantern sways from a nail outside one of the loading bays, its weak light barely cutting the mist. You step inside and find the ground floor swept clean, save for a scattering of crates along the walls. Between them, small groups linger: dock workers with faces half lit by lamplight. Women with shawls pulled close, a handful of sailors still smelling of salt and rope pitch. In one corner, a fiddler plays a slow reel, the notes weaving through the soft rumble of conversation. This isn't a brothel. There are no madams counting coins or inspectors peering in from the doorway. It's something more fluid, a gathering place where deals are made without set terms, where the evening might end in a room, a drink, or simply a warm corner to talk until dawn. Here's your mainstream historical fact: informal meeting spots like this, sometimes called flash houses, sprang up in many Victorian port districts. They were part tavern, part social club, part refuge, and often operated under the eye of owners willing to ignore transactions, so long as peace was kept. Historians still argue whether these spaces offered genuine safety or merely gave the illusion of it. A woman near the fiddler tips her head toward the door, telling you the unspoken rule: if the lantern is lit, newcomers are welcome. If it's dark, don't knock. That's your quirky tidbit for the night. One of those codes invisible to outsiders, but obvious to anyone who's walked these streets long enough. You take a seat on an upturned crate as a man in a blue wool cap slides a mug of small beer your way. He shrugs when you offer payment and says your first light joke that the only coin worth having tonight is a good story. As the evening stretches, more people drift in. A girl in a patched green skirt lays out a deck of cards and invites anyone to pay with gossip. The rules are loose: win a hand, learn something useful, lose and share something of your own. Soon the table is a tangle of whispered names, addresses, and scraps of news: who's hiring, who's gone to ground, which streets the inspectors are haunting this week. In a corner, two women sort through a sack of second-hand clothes, trading pieces like merchants at a fair. One triumphantly holds up a scarlet scarf, declaring it fit for a duchess or a dock rat, depending on the knot. Your second joke lands when her friend replies that the scarf will keep more than her neck warm if she finds the right buyer. A sailor from Cardiff joins the fiddler for a few songs, stamping his boots in time with the beat. Someone passes around a plate of pickled eggs, and the briny scent cuts through the smell of coal dust and beer. A woman beside you insists your quirky tidbit that eating something sour before heading home wards off bad luck, especially if you've just made a bargain you're not sure about. The mood is easy, the air warm despite the draft slipping through the loading bay doors. But then the lantern outside flickers twice a signal. Conversations drop. The fiddler lifts his bow from the strings. Within moments, shawls are wrapped tighter, mugs are drained, and people melt into the night through side doors and back alleys. You follow the tide of footsteps into the fog, realizing how quickly a space like that can fold itself away, leaving no trace for anyone who comes looking later. The quay is quiet again, the warehouses looming above like sleeping giants. The walk back takes you past streets you've already crossed tonight, but they feel different now, emptier, stretched. You pass the gin palace, its blue lamps dimmed. The chapel, its doors shut. The reform home silent behind high walls. The women who stood beneath the gas lamps earlier are gone, their places taken by puddles reflecting the moon. By the time you reach the edge of the district, the city's hum has softened to the occasional rattle of a distant cart or the echo of boots on stone. The air is cool enough to sting your nose. You realize you've been walking for hours, moving through a world most people pretend not to see, and yet it's one stitched so tightly into the city's fabric that pulling it loose would unravel far more than anyone admits. You stop under a lamp where the light pools gold on the cobbles. Somewhere far off, a church bell strikes the hour. You think of the faces you've seen tonight, some wary, some defiant, some laughing in the teeth of it all. You think of the codes passed in parasol tilts and shawl knots. The whispered warnings, the rooms behind heavy doors, and the spaces like that warehouse where for a few hours, the rules bent just enough to let people breathe. The fog swirls around your legs. A carriage passes without slowing. And as you turn toward home, you carry the quiet knowledge that you've glimpsed a map of the city invisible to most, a map drawn in shadows, in glances, in the flicker of a lantern that means you can come in. Now the streets are fading. The sharp edges of brick and stone blur in the soft breath of the fog, and the sounds of the night fold in on themselves one by one, as though the city is tucking them away for safekeeping. The last echoes of boots fade down an alley. The last glimmer of lamplight winks out as the gas is turned low. You let your steps slow until you're just standing there, breathing in the cool, damp air. The scent of coal smoke is faint, now softened by the salt of the river. Somewhere above, behind curtained windows, a piano plays a single, slow waltz, each note hanging in the air longer than it should. It sounds less like music and more like the memory of it. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the faint hum of the quay, the low voices in the warehouse, the muffled laughter over shared tea in the boarding house. But they're all dimming now, like lamps turned down in careful sequence. The city hasn't disappeared. It's just settled into the quiet that comes when you know morning will ask you to do it all again. You take one last breath, letting it fill your chest slowly, then leave just as slowly until the air inside, you feels as calm as the air outside. The night is still there, wrapped around you, but it's gentler now. Less a story you're moving through, and more a blanket drawn up to your chin. Somewhere a lantern might still be lit. Somewhere someone is still awake. But for you, the journey is done for tonight. You can let the fog close behind you and the city keep its watch while you drift into your own quiet.